The US government once secretly dosed innocent civilians with LSD without their knowledge. A sitting judge was caught selling children to a private prison for cash, and a major American city knowingly poisoned its own kids with lead water for 18 months while falsifying the safety reports. And those are just 3 of the 49 documented cases of real US corruption that most people have never heard about. Stick around, because what you're about to find out will completely change the way you see this country. And before we get into this, hit that subscribe button right now, because the people running this country are genuinely praying you don't watch this video. 1. Picture the Pentagon as that one friend who swears they're great with money, and then can't find their wallet, their car, or their pants. In 2018, the Department of Defense sat down for its very first audit in history, and immediately fumbled $21 trillion in transactions into the cosmic void. Auditors basically asked where the money went, and the Pentagon shrugged, like a teenager caught sneaking in at 3 a.m. They failed the next audit too, and the one after that. 7 consecutive failures, trillions unaccounted for, and somehow the building is still standing, and still asking for more. 2. Senators get something called a classified briefing, which sounds boring until you realize it is basically legalized cheat codes for the stock market. A regular Wall Street trader who acts on secret information gets perp-walked in handcuffs while cameras flash. A member of Congress who does the exact same thing gets a yacht and a book deal. Lawmakers have been caught dumping stocks days before pandemics, wars, and crashes, and the punishment is roughly equivalent to a stern look from a librarian. Insider trading is a felony for everyone in America except the people who wrote the law banning it. 3. Picture the CIA in the 1950s deciding the best way to fight communism was to slip acid into the coffee of unsuspecting Americans, and watch what happened. Project MK dosed mental patients, prisoners, soldiers, and random civilians with LSD in a wild hunt for mind control powers. Some subjects died and many were psychologically wrecked, yet exactly 0 superheroes were produced. When journalists started sniffing around, the director calmly ordered every file shredded into confetti. Nobody involved spent a single night in prison, and the whole disaster got quietly filed under unfortunate workplace mishaps in American history. 4. Pennsylvania Judge Mark Ciavarella looked at a courtroom full of teenagers and somehow saw a personal vending machine. His operation, later nicknamed Kids for Cash, shipped thousands of juveniles off to private detention centers for tiny offenses like mocking a principal online. In exchange, he pocketed $2.6 million in kickbacks from the prison company building those facilities. Families begged for mercy in front of a man mentally calculating his next yacht payment. The racket ran undisturbed for years before anyone noticed a judge living suspiciously like the villain in a straight-to-streaming thriller. 5. For decades, the DEA quietly hoovered up billions of American phone calls without bothering with anything as inconvenient as a warrant. They paired this hobby with a technique called parallel construction, which is fancy government wording for laundering illegal surveillance through a fake backstory. Agents would use the secret data to pinpoint a suspect, then invent a tidy fairy tale about a lucky traffic stop and feed it to judges with straight faces. Defendants had no clue their constitutional rights had been mulched, and entire courtrooms operated on what amounted to elaborately rehearsed government fanfiction for years. 6. Mississippi handed Governor Phil Bryant a giant pot of welfare money meant for the poorest families in the poorest state in America, and somehow that money paved the way for a luxury volleyball court at the University of Southern Mississippi. That happened to be the exact school where his own daughter played volleyball, which is quite the cosmic coincidence. Tens of millions meant for struggling mothers and hungry children got rerouted into shiny floors and pristine nets, while Brett Favre's name kept appearing in text messages. The poorest state in the country had accidentally funded a country club amenity. 7. OxyContin received FDA approval based on possibly the laziest evidence in medical history. A doctor named Herschel Jick wrote a tiny 1-paragraph letter back in 1980 saying addiction seemed rare, and later openly admitted he had no data to back any of it up. Purdue Pharma grabbed that scrap of paper and waved it around for decades like it was the Declaration of Independence, citing it as a landmark peer-reviewed study. Doctors trusted it, regulators trusted it, and an entire opioid epidemic launched itself off something that barely qualifies as a casual Yelp review. They ate. During the Great Depression, the federal government landed on the surreal idea of paying farmers to torch crops and slaughter livestock, while bread lines stretched around entire city blocks. Hungry families watched milk pour into ditches because economists had decided scarcity was somehow healthier than full bellies. The wildest part is that this approach never actually went away, because today the USDA still quietly hands out billions to farmers, specifically for not growing food. They call it stabilization, while fields sit deliberately empty, and Depression-era logic continues humming along happily inside modern government spreadsheets. Nobody seems eager to question. 9. Congressman Randy Duke Cunningham of California turned political corruption into something resembling a cheesecake factory menu. He literally kept a printed bribe price list on official congressional letterhead, complete with dollar figures matched to specific defense contracts. $16 million in government work apparently cost one antique commode, while $50 million required a yacht conveniently named the Duke Stir, which he was actually living on at the time. When investigators discovered the laminated menu inside his office, even hardened federal agents had to pause and quietly admire the sheer cinematic audacity of the whole criminal arrangement. 10. Alabama once tried to legalize electronic bingo and somehow spun the whole thing into a full-blown soap opera. The story involved suitcases stuffed with cash, fake charities laundering money like loose pocket lint, and lobbyists caught on wiretaps saying things no human mouth should ever produce. A sitting governor ended up tangled directly in the middle of the chaos. Federal prosecutors marched into court absolutely certain they were holding the slammiest of slam dunks. Then mistrials and acquittals piled up until nearly every defendant strolled back out the courthouse doors, whistling cheerfully into the Alabama sunshine. 11. The TSA once spent roughly $1 billion training officers to spot terrorists by reading body language, eye twitches, and suspicious sweating patterns at airport security lines. The program was called SPOT, and it sounded impressively scientific until an internal investigation actually tested its results. Officers performed worse than random chance, meaning a coin flip would have caught more bad guys than a trained human professional. Travelers got pulled aside for fidgeting, scratching, or simply looking tired after a red-eye flight. America essentially funded a billion-dollar psychic hotline staffed by people in polyester uniforms holding plastic wands. 12. Ferguson, Missouri quietly ran its entire municipal budget like a shakedown operation, aimed almost exclusively at black residents. A 142-page Department of Justice report later confirmed that police and courts were treated less like public services and more like collection agencies with badges. Officers were pressured to hit ticket quotas, fines snowballed into warrants, and warrants snowballed into jail time over things as small as a broken taillight. The city was essentially funding its potholes and paychecks through the wallets of the people it was supposedly protecting, which is a uniquely American twist on civic budgeting. 13. The United States military quietly paid the NFL roughly $6.8 million to stage those goosebump-inducing patriotic tributes during football games. Those salute-to-service moments, surprise homecomings, and giant flag unfurlings that made grown men ugly cry on national television were not spontaneous bursts of organic patriotism. They were paid advertisements billed by the league as heartfelt gestures. Fans assumed they were watching genuine emotion, while behind-the-scenes invoices were quietly changing hands. American patriotism had unknowingly been sponsored, packaged, and gift-wrapped like a halftime hot dog commercial with extra mustard. 14. During the Cold War, the CIA secretly funded abstract expressionist art, which is genuinely the strangest weapon ever pulled from a spy agency's toolbox. Agents covertly bankrolled painters like Jackson Pollock and quietly sponsored gallery exhibitions across Europe, using splatters and squiggles to flex American cultural superiority over the Soviets. The idea was that freedom looked like wild paint, while communism looked like boring tractors. Artists had no clue their patrons were intelligence officers in suits, and entire museum tours were essentially propaganda missions wrapped in pretentious wine receptions and very serious-looking men stroking their chins thoughtfully. 15. The federal agency responsible for overseeing offshore oil drilling, known as the Minerals Management Service, was caught running what can only be described as a frat house with a government logo. Inspectors were accepting cocaine, gifts, and sexual favors from the very oil companies they were supposed to regulate. Reports described parties, motorcycle outings, and inspections that felt more like vacations. Just weeks after these scandals surfaced, the Deepwater Horizon rig exploded into one of the worst environmental disasters in American history. The watchdog had basically been napping in the lap of the wolf for years. 16. The Small Business Administration handed out COVID relief loans with such breathtaking laziness that money flowed into businesses that did not exist anywhere on planet Earth. Auditors found loans approved for companies registered at vacant lots, abandoned buildings, and in one truly spectacular case, an address sitting in the middle of a highway. Imaginary farms, ghost barbershops, and fictional consulting firms collectively scooped up billions in taxpayer cash. Fraud investigators eventually pieced together a scheme so massive it might rank as the largest theft in American history, all powered by online forms nobody bothered to verify. 17. In January 2020, 3 United States senators sat through a classified briefing about a mysterious new virus spreading across the globe. Within days, they quietly dumped millions of dollars in stocks before the American public had any idea what was coming. Richard Burr, Kelly Loeffler, and a few others somehow timed the market with the elegance of a clairvoyant fortune teller. When journalists exposed the trades, hearings were called, eyebrows were raised, and stern words were exchanged. Then absolutely nothing happened, no charges were filed, and everyone simply returned to their regular schedule of pretending to govern. 18. Bell, California was a tiny working-class town of roughly 36,000 residents, where city manager Robert Rizzo had quietly been paying himself $787,000 a year. The city council was happily in on the arrangement, collecting suspicious salaries of their own for meetings that barely happened. Police chiefs and assistants were stacking similar paychecks while residents struggled to cover rent. The scheme ran undetected for years until reporters started asking awkward questions. A town that could barely afford streetlights had accidentally been bankrolling lifestyles fit for minor European royalty. 19. Over a 6-year stretch, the United States Department of Agriculture paid out more than $1 billion in farm subsidies to dead people. These were not recent passings either, because investigators found payments still flowing decades after the recipients had been comfortably 6 feet under. Ghost farmers were apparently America's most reliable agricultural workforce, never complaining, never missing deadlines, and never alive. Auditors flagged the absurdity repeatedly, yet checks kept arriving at empty farmhouses and forgotten estates. Somewhere a bureaucrat probably believed corn was being grown by the spectral hands of long-deceased gentlemen wearing overalls. 20. Operation Paperclip was the post-war program in which the United States quietly imported more than 1,600 Nazi scientists, handed them shiny new identities, and slotted them into jobs at NASA and across the military. Some of these gentlemen had cheerfully used concentration camp prisoners as slave labor just a few years earlier. Officials decided their rocket expertise was simply too useful to waste on minor concerns like accountability or basic human decency. America's path to the moon was essentially paved with paperwork shredders, fresh social security cards, and an enormous diplomatic shrug nobody wanted to discuss publicly. 21. The used-to-beef grading system that supposedly protects American consumers was actually designed in cozy partnership with the beef industry itself. The highest rating, that magical word prime stamped on expensive steaks, was specifically defined to reward the most heavily marbled and least heart-healthy cuts available. Marbling basically means fat, so the government officially crowned the artery-clogging option as the gold standard of American beef excellence. Shoppers proudly pay extra for that little prime sticker, completely unaware they are essentially purchasing a cardiologist's retirement plan wrapped in butcher paper and tied with a cheerful little string. 22. 2 pharmaceutical distributors managed to ship 780 million oxycodone and hydrocodone pills into West Virginia over just 6 years. The state's entire population at the time hovered around 1.8 million people, which works out to roughly 400 pills per resident, including infants and grandmothers. Internal alerts flagged the shipments repeatedly, and every single warning was somehow cleared by supervisors who apparently believed Appalachian towns were running mysterious headache conventions. By the time anyone acted, entire communities had been hollowed out, and pharmacies in tiny mountain hamlets were operating like roadside opioid drive-thrus. 23. COINTELPRO was the FBI's long-running hobby of psychologically tormenting civil rights leaders, peace activists, and anyone J. Edgar Hoover decided he disliked that morning. Agents tapped phones, planted informants, and spread vicious rumors designed to destroy marriages and reputations. The most jaw-dropping moment came when the Bureau mailed Martin Luther King Jr. an anonymous letter explicitly urging him to kill himself. America's top law enforcement agency essentially became a creepy stalker with a government badge. Decades later, the program was exposed, briefly condemned, and then quietly tucked into the dusty back drawer of national memory. 24. Flint, Michigan officials decided to save money by switching the city's water supply, and within days they realized lead was leaching out of aging pipes and into the homes of every resident. Instead of sounding the alarm, they spent 18 months falsifying safety reports while children drank, bathed in, and brushed their teeth with poisoned water. Babies developed rashes, families lost hair, and entire neighborhoods watched their tap water turn brown. The cost-cutting decision intended to balance a budget ended up producing a generational health catastrophe that left an entire city permanently scarred and deeply distrustful. 25. Congress quietly operates a taxpayer-funded slush fund used to settle misconduct claims against its own members, and over the years that pot has paid out more than $17 million in hush money. Sexual harassment, hostile workplaces, and assorted bad behavior all got smoothed over with checks written from public money. Settlements remained completely confidential, victims often signed non-disclosure agreements, and constituents kept happily re-electing officials whose offices had quietly bankrolled the cleanup. America's lawmakers essentially built themselves an in-house insurance policy against accountability, funded entirely by the same citizens being told to behave at work. 26. Oil companies were quietly handed federal drilling leases for prices so absurdly low they almost qualified as charity. Government auditors eventually discovered these companies had underpaid royalties by roughly $1 billion, which is the kind of accounting mistake that does not happen by accident. Reports were filed, hearings were held, and stern memos were drafted with great seriousness. Then Congress somehow declined to update the fee structure, leaving the entire arrangement intact. Public land, public oil, and public money kept funneling into private pockets, while the official response amounted to a polite cough and a meaningful glance. 27. Mylan's chief executive Heather Bresch, who also happened to be the daughter of a sitting United States senator, took the EpiPen price from roughly $100 to more than $600 in just a few years. During that same stretch, she rewarded herself with a 671% pay raise. Parents of children with deadly allergies suddenly faced impossible choices between groceries and life-saving medication. Congress dragged her into hearings, shook fingers dramatically, recorded angry sound bites for cameras, and then accomplished absolutely nothing of substance. The price stayed sky high while the senator's daughter kept smiling. 28. The private prison company Corrections Corporation of America once offered to buy state prisons directly from cash-strapped governments, with one tiny condition baked into the contracts. States had to guarantee the prisons would remain at least 90% full at all times, or pay financial penalties. Mass incarceration was essentially written into legally binding paperwork like a Netflix subscription with cancellation fees. Judges, prosecutors, and lawmakers were quietly handed an economic incentive to keep human beings locked up. Empty cells became a budget problem, which is possibly the bleakest sentence ever written about American criminal justice policy. 29. The Army Corps of Engineers built the levees protecting New Orleans, and internal documents later revealed engineers had flagged serious design flaws years before Hurricane Katrina ever appeared on a weather map. Memos warned about insufficient strength, faulty soil analysis, and structural weaknesses that could fail under heavy storm surge. Those warnings sat quietly in filing cabinets, ignored by the same agency responsible for fixing them. When Katrina arrived, the levees collapsed exactly where engineers had predicted, drowning entire neighborhoods. The disaster was less a natural catastrophe and more a slow-motion bureaucratic shrug finally hitting the water. 30. Credit rating agencies in America operate under a setup so spectacularly conflicted it sounds like a deleted scene from a heist movie. The banks selling complicated financial products are the same banks paying the agencies that rate those products. Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch happily stamped AAA ratings on toxic mortgage bonds before the 2008 crash, essentially writing glowing reviews for the customers signing their paychecks. Trillions evaporated, millions lost homes, and the global economy nearly imploded. The wildest part is that this arrangement is still completely legal and still operating exactly the same way today. 31. Martin Frankel pulled off one of the strangest financial crimes in American history by inventing a fake Catholic charity, then using it to quietly purchase insurance companies across multiple states. He looted roughly $200 million, fled to Germany, and might have vanished forever into a life of yachts and forged passports. Instead, the man accidentally set his own Connecticut mansion on fire while frantically burning incriminating documents. Firefighters arrived to find smoldering evidence scattered everywhere like a confession written in soot. America's slickest con artist had been undone by the same skill set as a careless backyard barbecue dad. 32. When the United States government finally agreed to compensate communities exposed to nuclear testing fallout, officials drew the eligibility maps with all the geographic accuracy of a toddler holding a crayon. Entire towns across Arizona and Nevada that had been blanketed in radioactive dust were quietly left off the boundaries. Families who watched their relatives die of cancers, traced directly to atomic clouds, suddenly discovered they lived in the wrong invisible rectangle. The fallout did not care about lines on a federal map, but the settlement checks absolutely did, leaving the most affected Americans completely outside the official apology zone. 33. Puerto Rico's massive debt crisis was partly engineered by Wall Street banks selling specially designed bonds intended to sneak around the territory's constitutional debt limit. The financial products were crafted with the elegance of a tax evasion magic trick, dressed up in legal language that nobody on the island fully understood. Courts later ruled the bonds outright illegal, which sounds like justice until you remember the banks had already collected every juicy fee long before the gavel ever dropped. Puerto Rico got crushing debt and brutal austerity, while the bankers walked away whistling toward their next yacht delivery. 34. Abscam was the FBI sting in which agents dressed as Arab sheikhs offered fake bribes to American politicians. And somehow 6 sitting congressmen and 1 United States senator happily lined up to accept envelopes of cash on hidden camera. The footage shows them grinning, stuffing bills into pockets, and reassuring the supposed sheikhs they could absolutely deliver favors. It was such a wildly cinematic scandal, it eventually inspired a Hollywood movie. Yet within just a few years, the entire country essentially forgot it ever happened. Like collective amnesia, gently swept the whole embarrassing chapter under the national rug. 35. The United States spent 40 long years running the Tuskegee experiment on black men in Alabama, telling syphilis patients they were receiving free medical treatment while doctors actually withheld penicillin to study how the disease ravaged their bodies. Hundreds suffered, many died, wives were infected, and children were born with congenital syphilis. The whole horror show continued long after penicillin became the universally accepted cure. Government scientists treated human beings like lab mice while patting themselves on the back for advancing medical knowledge. It only ended in 1972 because a whistleblower finally leaked everything to a reporter. 36. Researchers have crunched the numbers on American democracy and discovered something deeply unflattering about how Congress actually behaves. Bills with strong public support but zero industry backing pass at roughly 5%, while bills with no public support but powerful industry backing pass at almost exactly the same rate. In other words, your opinion as a regular voter carries about the same weight as a sneeze in a hurricane. Lobbyists basically operate like premium subscribers to the legislative process. The whole arrangement raises uncomfortable questions about who the government actually represents, and the answer rhymes with money. 37. The Bureau of Indian Affairs managed Native American trust funds for more than a century, collecting royalties from oil, gas, timber, and grazing rights owed to tribes across the country. When tribes finally sued for a basic accounting, the federal government cheerfully admitted it had lost track of billions of dollars and could not produce records going back decades. Files were missing, ledgers had vanished, and entire warehouses of paperwork apparently evaporated into thin air. America's longest-running bookkeeping disaster shrugged its way through court while generations of Native families watched the government misplace their inheritance. 38. During the 1940s, General Motors, Firestone, and Standard Oil formed a quiet little front company and went shopping across America for electric streetcar systems. They bought up the trolleys in dozens of cities, ripped out the tracks, scrapped the cars, and replaced everything with rumbling GM buses running on Firestone tires and Standard Oil fuel. Entire urban transit networks were dismantled essentially to boost corporate profits. Cities that once moved on quiet electric rails suddenly choked on diesel fumes. America's love affair with traffic jams was not entirely accidental, because 3 corporations carefully arranged the marriage behind closed boardroom doors. 39. The federal program known as 1033 has quietly transferred roughly $7.4 billion worth of military hardware to local police departments across the country. Tanks, grenade launchers, armored personnel carriers, and night vision goggles have rolled into sleepy towns where the biggest annual crime is usually a teenager spray painting a stop sign. Tiny rural sheriff offices suddenly possess equipment designed for foreign battlefields. Oversight is almost laughably thin, training requirements are minimal, and accountability is essentially optional. America's hometown police departments quietly transformed into miniature occupying armies, all without a single voter ever being asked their opinion. 40. The federal agency tasked with protecting coal miners had a quiet little tradition of tipping off mining companies before safety inspections were scheduled to take place. Advance warnings flowed so routinely that inspectors sometimes arrived to find violations conveniently scrubbed away, hazards freshly painted over, and workers nervously pretending nothing dangerous had ever existed. The system designed to prevent collapses and explosions was essentially running a courtesy reservation hotline for the companies it regulated. Miners kept dying in entirely preventable disasters, while regulators kept politely calling ahead, like dinner guests not wanting to catch their hosts undressed. 41. In 1999, a Memphis jury quietly delivered a stunning verdict in a civil case called King versus Jowers, finding that government agencies were part of a conspiracy in the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. The United States government settled the case without much fuss, and the entire story received almost zero national news coverage. A jury had essentially ruled that the murder of America's most iconic civil rights leader involved official hands, and the country collectively responded with crickets. Most Americans alive today have never heard a single sentence about the verdict, which is itself a kind of historical magic trick. 42. During the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve quietly loaned out roughly $16 trillion to banks and corporations without ever asking Congress for permission. Hundreds of billions of those dollars flowed to foreign banks, which is the kind of detail that tends to raise eyebrows when it eventually surfaces. The entire arrangement only came to light because a one-time audit was forced through after enormous political pressure. American taxpayers had unknowingly co-signed the largest emergency bailout in human history. The whole operation made trillion-dollar transactions look like discreet birthday gifts passed across a polished mahogany table. 43. Fame of flood maps that determine which American homes sit inside dangerous flood zones were drawn with direct input from real estate developers who had enormous financial incentives to keep their own properties safely outside those zones. The official maps used to protect lives ended up structurally engineered to protect property values instead. Neighborhoods that absolutely flood got quietly marked as dry, while flood insurance requirements vanished like magic. When storms inevitably arrived, families discovered their homes had been deemed safe by a cartographic process roughly as rigorous as a developer drawing imaginary lines on a cocktail napkin. 44. Members of Congress operate without any mandatory ethics training, face no real rules preventing them from sitting on committees that regulate industries they personally own stock in, and can happily vote on legislation that directly moves their own investment portfolios. Imagine a referee allowed to bet on the team he is officiating while writing the rulebook in real time. America's lawmakers essentially built a workplace with fewer ethical safeguards than the average suburban dental office. The system runs entirely on the honor code, and the honor in question belongs to the same people writing the honor code. 45. The tobacco industry spent decades funding fake scientific institutions with extremely legitimate-sounding names, all designed to manufacture public doubt about smoking and cancer. Internal company documents had already confirmed cigarettes were killing customers, yet executives still cheerfully pumped money into research groups that produced reassuring studies about clean lungs and happy moods. Doctors appeared in advertisements recommending specific brands, while millions of Americans inhaled their way into early graves. The entire playbook of professional scientific deception was essentially invented here, then later borrowed almost word for word by industries selling everything from leaded gasoline to climate denial. 46. A Detroit Medicare fraud scheme worth roughly $2.3 billion revolved around fake HIV clinics billing the government for elaborate treatments given to patients who did not actually have HIV. The operation ran for years because Medicare is legally barred from verifying diagnoses before paying claims, which is the kind of policy choice that sounds invented by a cartoon villain. Fraudsters discovered that government checks would arrive faster than questions, and they cheerfully cashed in. The American healthcare system essentially operates on the trust-based honor code, except the honor belongs to people inventing imaginary patients. 47. West Virginia's opioid distribution chain became so spectacularly corrupt that pharmacies in tiny mountain towns were receiving monthly pill shipments larger than the entire population of the surrounding county. The DEA's own computer system flagged these shipments repeatedly, lighting up internal warnings like a Christmas tree in a coal mine. Supervisors then quietly overrode those alerts through internal approval processes that essentially functioned as a polite ignore button. Communities of a few hundred people received enough opioids to medicate small armies, and the regulators charged with stopping it instead spent years stamping approvals while obituaries piled up. 48. The CIA spent years running extraordinary rendition flights, secretly transporting terrorism suspects to countries where torture was conveniently legal. The flights used front companies and fake tail numbers, and the planes were officially registered to shell businesses operating out of addresses that turned out to be empty mailboxes in suburban office parks. Journalists eventually traced the aircraft back to phantom corporations staffed by nobody, headquartered nowhere, and owned by ghosts. America was essentially running an outsourced torture airline using paperwork so fake it would embarrass a teenager forging a fake ID for a homecoming dance after-party. 49. The United States Witness Protection Program has quietly relocated and handed brand new identities to documented murderers, drug traffickers, and organized crime figures in exchange for their cooperation in court. Some of these freshly minted citizens then proceeded to commit entirely new crimes under their government-issued names. The program eventually lost track of a number of them, which is the bureaucratic equivalent of misplacing your car keys, except the car keys are convicted killers. America essentially built a national witness protection conveyor belt that occasionally drops dangerous people back into unsuspecting neighborhoods with shiny new names and excellent fake resumes. And there you have it. 49 glorious chapters of American shenanigans that somehow never made it into your high school history textbook. Probably because the textbook publishers were busy lobbying Congress for tax breaks. If even one of these stories made your jaw hit the floor, or your eyebrow do that suspicious little twitch, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring the notification bell so BrainFumble can keep digging up the receipts. Share this with that one friend who still trusts everything. Now tell me down in the comments, which of these 49 cases broke your brain the hardest?